Welcome back, everyone. So, just looking at the chat from the last session, Justin in Cardiff had a question about non-native species. Justin, are you back yet? I think we're still waiting for Justin. And then we had C, whoever C was. Are they back yet? In that case, I'm going to turn to Penny Griffith. Penny, you had a question. Could you unmute yourself to ask it to John?
Yeah, I guess it wasn't necessarily a question for John. It was more a question for everybody else. I absolutely agree with the conversation that was just had about changing the focus. I think we need to change the focus from seeing the benefit and the capital investment of something and being more about the longevity and the functionality of it. And I was just wondering, I have this conversation with the grant providers all the time. I was just wondering, as we're a Welsh pan-Wales group here today, are we all having that conversation? Are we all having that conversation out loud? Because for me, that's the really important bit around the capital revenue argument. So I guess that's a bit hard to answer, really, because everybody can't unmute themselves. So it's just more pondering.
Yeah, I can chip in because things are changing. When we enacted Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, and what the hell has that got to do with wildflowers? We spent a lot of time debating about how we were going to get these sustainable drainage systems to be managed, because they're drains, they have to be managed. If they don't, places flood. So now there's a principle in Welsh law, at least, that if you're putting in drains, sustainable drainage systems which are vegetated, then you have to have maintenance plans and funding plans in place to fund the maintenance of those places for the whole life of the development.
Which is fine if you're doing the commutative sums, but if you're retrofitting an existing streetscapes using capital funding to put the retrofit in, and there's no built in for that for any revenue costs, and you're dealing with a highways department and parks department who are seeing their continual cuts of resources, that's the tricky thing. I think the commuter sums absolutely for new developments, but that doesn't necessarily, it has to be over a certain size, doesn't it, for that to kick in. And the smaller the smaller designs, which can have a really huge cumulative impact, don't necessarily get caught by that. Sorry, I'm taking too much of the conversation, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah. Just to let people know that sustainable drainage systems, they have to be, by law, put into any development over 100 square meters that requires planning permission, and it can be development or redevelopment. So if somebody's doing anything in a street that needs planning permission and it's going to need draining, then that requires a sustainable drainage system. They have to provide biodiversity and amenity benefits by law. And by law, under criterion 6, they've got to have a management plan and they've got to have funding, which could be a charge like you'd get if you were leasing a flat, you know, to maintain the roof. Even if you're in a basement flat, you're still charged to maintain the roof. So that could be a funding mechanism. I think I've gone on way too long about funding for SUDS. I'm wondering if we've got Justin back from Cardiff yet. Doesn't look as if we have. So I'm going to ask his question for him. John, how do you value non-native species in the schemes that you do? And you're going to need to unmute.
Sorry, here you go. Yeah, I mean, I think what is interesting for me, what was fascinating about non-natives, especially my interest in sort of the edge lands and the kind of brownfield sites, especially around us in Essex, was that, you know, these places are made up of both native and non-native, and some of those, certainly some of the non-natives that in those places are actually incredibly important plants. You know, Michaelmas daisy, stuff like that. You know, goldenrod. You know, these are plants that come into those places and actually incredibly valuable. So I take quite a pragmatic view about that, especially as we're dealing in very urban places. And I think it's that wonderful mix of the two that is the joy of a lot of urban landscapes. And if you take, for instance, I guess, like I'd imagine quite a few of you know about the biodiversity report that Fergus had done at Great Dixter. If you haven't, it's a really great thing to have a little look at. So he had a biodiversity report done for Great Dixter, which is a very well, it's not traditional garden, but it's a very English garden, I would say, in a lot of respects, and obviously an ornamental garden. Turns out, biodiversity-wise, it's absolutely full. In fact, a lot better than the nature reserves around where it is. And he has that pragmatic view of native, non-native. And I think it's the balance between the two that's the key thing. You know, I talked quickly about the bryony bee. You know, the bryony bee only has the pollen from bryony. So obviously, unless you have the native bryony, you won't get the bee. So there's going to be that balance. But I think it's rather beautiful to see species, you know, alongside our native species. And that's what a lot of the images and a lot of the landscapes we do are the mix of both. Now, if out in the middle of a rural space, I think it's a different thing altogether, but absolutely in an urban space, because I think we've got to value what people want as well. We've got to value the aesthetic alongside the biodiversity value, and have the humility to understand that these places are not where we live. They're actually places where someone else lives. And I think that's the key to creating a place that people are going to enjoy, is having that understanding. And I think that understanding of place and understanding of people's preferences does come from having gardeners embedded in the place. It's not easy to turn up as a designer with a clipboard and find out what people want who live there, to be honest.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Liz, you've got a question in the chat, Liz Mills. I wonder if you'd unmute yourself to ask that to John.
Hi, yes, and the camera. Yes,
Hi.
so I'm not a professional working in this area. So I'm not an ecologist and a scientist and all the rest of it, but more of a policy analyst. So my question is, I'm not sure I've got a copy of exactly what I said, but in order to attract more resources or secure more resources, what about making a more explicit connection to adaptation to climate change and especially water management? So Pete, you've already mentioned SUDS. You know, but I'm thinking more of unsealing of existing hard surfaces, which I think is still in Planning Policy Wales, you know, for maximising the area of impermeable surface. So other countries, especially the Netherlands, which I know quite well, they have a national programme, and it's called Steenbreek, which translates as stone breaking, which is a national programme of unsealing, working with local communities. So they're actually getting people to dig up paving in their front gardens and that kind of thing, in order to, it's mostly better really for water management, but of course for biodiversity too. So maybe we should be thinking more about that, in addition to, for example, when you're doing something with a brownfield site, I expect you are breaking up the impermeable surface and replacing it. So how about doing this more on a small scale as well? So a few thoughts in there, really.
Yeah, I mean, anything that would move resources into more soil and plants in cities has got to make sense. No? But it's ironically, some of the brownfield areas, some of the brownfield sites that are some of the areas on some brownfield sites quite important are actually impermeable layers, where there's a soil surface that's worked out, that's moved in over the top, and is incredibly stressful, and then that supported incredibly interesting bunch of plants. Again, it's a different context, but I think it's just that the wonderful mix of things is what obviously we're in desperate need of. And at the moment in cities, certainly we never have enough soft landscaping, do we? We never have enough of that landscape, because we argue that we can't look after it. I think that's the biggest. Usually that's what stops these things. Or they go in with money, which is the most usual thing. They go in with lots of money and then they're never looked after. And then there's a whole kind of backlash against those landscapes then. There's a sadness to that, I think, that's quite important. And certainly in London, in my experience, we've put in, you know, quite a few community gardens, and there's been lots of schemes done. And without paid people to make them work long term, they don't work, in my opinion, anyway.
And while we're on the subject, John, in one of your latest videos that you posted on LinkedIn, and if people are not connected to John on LinkedIn, I'd highly recommend it. You looked at some of the things that you'd done in your own garden, some of the trial plots you'd got there, and there seemed to be this theme running through that the higher the nutrient status, the more lush or rank the vegetation was, and the more intervention it needed. Could you talk a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a common knowledge, really. I guess usually the more organic content in the soil, the more maintenance it requires, and I guess we all know that. And there's nothing, wrong with, obviously, I mean, beautiful, rich, organic soils are absolutely full of life, very important. But if they're looked at practically within a urban landscape context, and there's not the maintenance there, then they become places that people don't want to be around and don't want to see. So I think when you take the nutrient level down, you just give yourself more chance to maintain that space, more chance to actually make it a beautiful place and a very diverse place from a plant point of view. So if there's a scheme going in, and if you've got the chance to, even if it's as simple as moving a little bit of topsoil, making an area thicker topsoil there and subsoil there, just that one intervention will immediately open up more possibilities regards to plants and give you much more hope, really, that you're going to be able to look after it. Because you can make topsoil be what it wants to be. You just need more people. I mean, there's someone like Dixter and some of the amazing gardens that Fergus does. I mean, they're beautiful places. They're very rich, very lush, but they take a lot of looking after. I mean, that's inevitable, really. I think I always think I'm trying to get a bit of Dixter on the cheap and get it into a social housing estate. And the only way I can do that, probably without lots of investment in gardeners, is to actually take the fertility down a bit. And then there's a bit more chance, And of course, within a development, there's the opportunity to reuse the materials that were already on site, and actually reuse the materials on site within the landscape, not just back into the construction. I think if there was a conversation early on about what waste was going to be produced by a development, what was the likely waste, what kind of waste was it, and then have a conversation about how that might be very important for habitat and for plant diversity if we use it back in the landscape, that would be a pretty cool thing. And I think you could get all sorts of interesting things happen off the back of that.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Can I turn to Marie Fowler from Neath Port Talbot? You've got your hand raised. Would you like to turn on your camera and ask John your question?
Good morning. Thank you, Peter. Yes, my question is essentially in relation to, we've spoken a lot about obviously the wildlife and the flora, etc., above ground, but there doesn't seem to be much discussions about what's happening in terms of the wildlife that actually lives in the soils. And I was just pondering, because obviously you mentioned having, introducing more soils and more sort of free draining or low nutrient sort of type soils. Isn't that going to have eventually an impact, or if we start doing that a little bit too much, on the biodiversity of those species that are more reliant on nutrient-rich soils?
Of course. But if you heard me talk earlier on, I was suggesting that we make these decisions much more when the topsoil has already been taken away, and then we decide where the topsoil wants to come back, because we need a combination, don't we, of the two? Because topsoil is full of life and certainly supports a particular flora. So we need that, and we need, I'd suggest, lower fertility as a contrast, and a contrast in habitat and flora mix, because at the moment we have, when a scheme goes in, it's blanketed back with the same topsoil everywhere to the same depth. And I'm just suggesting that to make a place more dynamic and more biodiverse, we should be mixing that up. So we should have a proportion of topsoil and a proportion of lower fertility, some topography. We should just make the place more complicated. And I'm not in any way underestimating the value of, good quality topsoil, because it obviously supports an incredible amount of wildlife, especially if it's got a lot of organic material in. But I'm suggesting on schemes where you're importing soils, where you're deciding where the soils go, which is what the case nearly on all these big schemes, that we could make the place more biodiverse and more interesting if we decided that we didn't need topsoil everywhere. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, this is one of my concerns when we start looking at, for instance, a lot of the SUD schemes that have been going on. Obviously, they're looking at very free draining sort of materials and stuff like that. And that, you know, I can't help but wonder, yes, it's all very good and well to have these features in, but as you just pointed out, we're not really getting a bit of a mosaic in terms of the topography of those, you know, those different layers of soils and stuff like that. So essentially, we've been quite monolithic in the terms of what type of planting we're putting in as well. I find, you know, a lot of it is like typical sort of types of grasses, typical types of plants. Certainly what I've seen being delivered in, you know, in Wales. And this is why I asked the question, really, because I'm wondering, are we actually missing out on something there? Or are we're talking about biodiversity above ground, and we think about us, you know, visually looking at it, but there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more to it, as you know, in terms of what goes on underground.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's just the case, it's the proportion, isn't it? I think if you're talking about the total biodiversity of a space, if you treat it all the same and you put the same soil back everywhere and it's fairly flat, I'd suggest that the diversity of plant and life would be reduced in comparison. And that's why that brownfield site near me is literally one of the best places in the country, biodiversity wise. And that's literally happened within 50 years because it's a very much more complicated place than the bit of topsoil and then next to it. Do you know what I mean? I think it's just the balance of these things, isn't it? I think at the moment we've defaulted to that same default when we do a new scheme. We always cover it in the same, whether it be manufactured topsoil or topsoil that we bring back in. And I'm just suggesting that we should look and have a conversation to say, do we need to put that everywhere? And certainly topography opens up lots of more opportunities as well. And I think that's underplayed within a scheme as well.
I think it's underplayed within the SUDs as well, within the SUD schemes. I think
I think a lot of SUD schemes would benefit from. I mean, in London, the southeast, for instance, they put fairly rich soil, the finishing soil in, and then they plant it with plants that supposedly like a bit of wet. And then we have 2 months of dry in London, and they all go. I think you could treat a SUD scheme as essentially a soak away, and we could use low nutrient, freer draining material that could be mounded even on top, and we could have a contrasting vegetation. It would still work as a SUD simply from an engineering point of view, but the flora on top have much more chance to survive, because a lot of SUD schemes in London, certainly, they dry out so much that the wet loving plants don't exist, don't live. So I think it'd be a really interesting conversation to have a look at what SUD's vegetation should be like, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. This background behind me is a SUDS. It's one of the original ones that started off thing. I mean, this is Sweden, but yeah, this kicked off what happened in Portland, Oregon, which then became the poster child for SUDS around the world.
Yeah.
And as a badly trained SUDS designer, I think it's essential that we could create topographical diversity. In constrained urban areas, that's a problem. But where we're talking about new development, the new development should conform with the existing topography, and we absolutely should be looking at bunds and banks to help direct the water and to help slow the flow. Even where we're creating rain gardens, which necessarily have to have very carefully designed soils that have got specific permeability to allow the water to do what the SUDS is there to do, which is to drain it. But the first principle of SUDS in Wales is that water is a precious resource, and we should be using that to water our new biodiverse landscapes that we're creating. So maybe this is another webinar for the future. I'm wondering, John, in the last 2 minutes before we have to sign off, have you got any concluding remarks, any final thoughts, anything that you wish had come up in this webinar that didn't?
Well, I guess essentially, if we could concentrate on two things, I think concentrate on investment in people to put into the landscape, and just keep in our heads that complicated landscapes are beautiful landscapes, I would suggest.
And I think that's a perfect thought to leave us on. So I'd like to thank you very much indeed, John, for your wisdom and for your provocation today. And
Well, Nice to be here, Peter. It's really lovely and great to meet everyone, kind of virtually.